The night of Yharnam was never only weather and lamps. It was an older tide moving through arteries, a pressure that gathered in bell towers and behind shutters, a slow insistence that the human body was not the only instrument playing. In that tide, faith and caution traded places. Remedies became rituals. Prayers were poured rather than spoken. The hunter's dream rose within this music as a counter-melody, a moonlit lawn beyond the hedge of sleep, crafted and granted so that the work of the night could continue without surrendering the soul that did it. The world that required such a refuge spoke in two registers. One was the visible grammar of streets and districts where the healing church dispensed its celebrated blood and maintained its processions. The other was the grammar of the great ones, beings whose awareness did not commute by road, who answered to callings made of memory and longing rather than trumpets and orders. Scholars learned that thought itself could be given architecture, that dreams and nightmares were not metaphors but places as durable as any parish and more obedient to bargains than to laws. The city stood between those grammars and tried to keep both in view. The dream stood slightly apart and kept the city from breaking while it tried. The hunter's dream was one such place. It looked gentle because that was the point. Dew on trimmed grass, a workshop with familiar timbers, a lamp whose halo never sputtered, a sky whose color answered to rules more than to weather. In the dream, death yielded, not forever, but long enough for purpose to be refreshed and for resolve to be cleaned of panic. Tools were mended, nerves were steadied, memory was cradled so that it would not break. None of this was free. The great ones were presences rather than persons, minds that moved like tides and listened like wells. They desired offspring and adopted them. They answered petitions wrapped in ritual and blood. Some preferred song, some preferred silence. All imposed a price. Yharnam learned too late that proximity to such attention thinned the ordinary fencing that protects a mind. A dream in this cosmology was not a reverie. It was a bounded realm made of intention and pact, where time obeyed a different conductor and where landscapes held the texture of decisions as much as of stone. The threat the dream addressed was simple to name and terrible to bear. Without respite, the hunt would devour those who conducted it. The old blood strengthened arms and sharpened eyes. It also invited transformations that ended households and emptied wards. Hunters spent themselves like candles in a wind. The dream inserted an intermission into a night that did not end at dawn. It served as harbor, as hospital, as ledger. It did not abolish horror. It managed tempo, prevented collapse, and made the next act possible. Its origin can be told as an old protocol. First came the problem. Curative blood moved from chapels to basins to veins, and with it came visions no catechism could frame. Patients became beasts. Preachers became choristers. Fear was recast as reverence and then as obedience. The nights grew longer and the city's ordinary courage was not enough. Then came a council that never met at a single table. At Bürgenwerth, a master named Willem counseled patience, teaching that eyes were preferable to conclusions and that insight without humility only scorches. In another wing, former students led by Lawrence rushed ahead, praying upward and drilling downward, convinced that revelation favored the bold. Between these two currents, a settlement formed. A dream would be made or invited. A caretaker would be bound to it. A path would be offered to those whom the work would otherwise destroy. After the settlement, there was a sacrifice, A craftsman of the hunt stepped forward, seasoned in motion and exact in judgment. He agreed to anchor the dream. He would receive the broken. He would test their willingness to continue. He would, when generosity and justice demanded, cut the cord that tied a hunter to the living night and let them rest. His workshop would be mirrored in softened wood and warm lamplight. His garden would be restful and exact. His own rest would be postponed. He would be remembered by few at sunrise and thanked by none in parades. The small spirits who labored for the dream knew his name and rustled approvingly when he passed. Finally, there was an avatar to keep the light steady. She resembled Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, a woman whose grave the caretaker visited with a grief he refused to rehearse aloud. She was not a replacement. She was a response to a different need. She kept the books, tended the messengers, and bestowed strength in a manner that felt like remembering a kindness rather than receiving a favor. Her voice never hurried. Her hands never trembled. She was made to cradle fatigue without judgment and to remind even the proud that gentleness is a kind of power. So the dream took form. Messengers rose from the soil like helpful thoughts. Lamps taught their constant lesson. When a hunter arrived with eyes too bright and hands unsteady, the attendant reminded them of simple order. One tool at a time. One oath at a time. One street at a time. The lawn remained damp even when the city burned. The workshop's doors kept their fit even when its twin in the waking world had long since sagged and splintered. In that braid of continuity, mortal effort could be renewed without being erased. The hidden wanderer era began quietly. He woke beneath a clinic's lamp with borrowed blood in his veins and a mark behind his eyes. She rose from a gravestone with a cough and a borrowed blade. They heard a bell that sometimes rang and sometimes did not, and they followed it without fully knowing its ringer. The hunter was not yet a legend. The dream was not yet a prison. The work remained simple in principle. Track the beasts. Learn their pattern. Offer release with as much mercy as the streets allowed. Return when the mind shook like glass and the hands forgot their certainty. The lawn welcomed them without record of complaint. He walked beneath the boughs and remembered apprentices who had called him teacher and friends who had called him by name. He watched the moon's angle and felt it tug at his joints like a tide. He softened his voice for the newly arrived who paced, tested their grip, and blinked as if waking in a familiar room with one wall moved half a step. He listened to reports of alleys that no longer connected, of clerics who no longer preached, of eyes that perched in high corners like patient spiders. He nodded without adding fear to their stock. He sent them back when they could stand again. She learned that a trick weapon was not only a mechanism but a posture. It let a hunter change the sentence of a fight without changing the conviction behind it. She learned that attire carried memory, that thread could be proof against madness when it had been worn by someone who had already refused it. She learned that runes devised by a careful student named Kirill could be inscribed without ink, and that such words were not spells but agreements, granting poise, resilience, or breath. She learned to speak softly to the messengers and to let them answer by action rather than by sound. They came and went in cycles. Some grew too confident and needed a kind correction. Some grew too burdened and needed to be told that leaving was an honorable answer. Some stayed because staying was easier than choosing. The caretaker saw himself in every category and smiled without admitting it. The attendant kept her hands folded when not lifting. and lifted only with the gentleness one associates with old nurses or with statues carved to represent them. The dream did not promise victory. It promised steadiness, and steadiness often provided what victory could not. The ledger of powers and limits was never chalked on the workshop wall. It was learned by repetition. The dream could repair flesh that had been cut. It could not repair covenants broken on purpose. It could reset a spine or soothe a tremor. It could not close a mind once opened too wide without exacting a quiet toll. It could move a hunter between lamps in the time it takes to draw breath. It could not move a city through its own night as if the city were a trivial problem. It accepted offerings and returned strength. It rejected pride and returned silence. Insight was the difficult column. It served as currency in one sense, offered and received for adjustments that no ordinary physician could perform. It served as pressure in another sense, a measure of how much a hunter had seen and how little they could now forget. Insight clarified visions. Insight thinned comforting veils. Insight improved the grace with which one dodged and paid for that grace with sleep that grew thinner every week. The caretaker watched newcomers handle it the way one watches a promising apprentice handle fire. He corrected them when they tried to hold it directly for too long. The dream practiced restraint as part of its power. The garden did not argue with the streets. It allowed the streets to unfold while holding a corner of calm open. The workshop did not advertise itself as unassailable. Tools broke there and were mended with the same economy one applies to shoes and watches. No one gave speeches. Mechanics spoke louder than oratory. When a hunter insisted on philosophy, the caretaker nodded and pointed toward the whetstone. When a hunter insisted on silence, the attendant poured the needful draught and let the room agree. Yet there was a shadow at the hedge. The dream had a patron. One did not need to see it to accept this. An agreement bound the caretaker to this lawn. An agreement folded each hunter into a cycle of waking cruelty and sleeping reprieve. The patron desired the hunt to continue. It desired the worst nights to be survivable and therefore repeatable. It desired a garden in which its gardener would stand until the correct successor took his place, because the garden was a lever and the city a fulcrum, and both were necessary to move the weight of a world leaning toward ruin. The name of this patron would be spoken rarely, its will would be felt often. The crisis that made the dream most necessary had been seeded earlier, far from the gaslit wards. At a gray shore, a quiet fishing hamlet suffered an injury that was not immediately visible but was absolute. A body of a great one, Kos, was hauled from the water. A curse followed. The curse did not shout. It threaded itself through time and turned a certain class of wrongdoer into a subset of night workers who no longer slept like other people. Their penance became the hunter's nightmare with its own architecture. Their shame became geography. By the time the city learned to pronounce the events that preceded the curse, the correction was already a place and not a policy. Another crisis was public and proud. The choir established communion with Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, whose residence complicated the word below. Ram, the vacuous spider, prolonged a veil that kept the moon from revealing its full hunger. An earlier master counseled restraint from his chair and spoke of fear as a kind of wisdom. Between these currents, the sky began to press on the streets, and lamps guttered for reasons that had nothing to do with wind. The dream brightened without warming. Hunters arrived more often and with stranger reports. When the veil thinned, arrivals trembled and spoke of statues that shifted when no one watched, of bridges that heaved like ribs, of hands that moved a fraction of a second before the mind admitted deciding. The caretaker gave them tasks and pretended not to notice the tremor. The attendant took longer to say simple blessings and made each syllable carry weight. The dream held. The dream's found an anchor was a workshop that predated it. In the waking city, a craftsman and his students had shaped the art of hunting, not as revenge but as emergency medicine applied at street scale. They refined tools that folded and locked. They studied the motion of beasts and wrote their findings in steel and wood rather than in treatises. They trained hands to be precise and hearts to be steady. When that workshop burned, it did not stop existing. Every good workshop continues in the bodies of those it trained, and the dream used that truth and made it durable. Unification was therefore not a parade. It was the quiet reopening of a school with a new address. The oath asked for no vanity. Protect the city without being remembered by it. Accept that the cure is imperfect and the nights are long. Use the dream as a means, not an end. Return to the lawn when your fingers shake too badly to tie a bandage. Hand your echoes to the attendant without pride. Listen when the caretaker cuts the cord and tells you that you have earned the right to stop. Do not argue when he says you have not. Expansion followed the same ethic. Diplomacy first. A word on a stoop before a slash in a stairwell. A pause to allow a terrified resident to bolt their shutters. A nod to another hunter whose oath differed but whose aim aligned. War only when necessary and then precise. Recover lieutenants who had drifted. Offer them bread, threadbare honor, and a reason to rest under the same moon. Some accepted, some refused and held their own streets. The dream did not demand uniformity. It demanded containment, mercy, and the quiet pride of clean work. Doctrine and device interlocked. The doctrine was simple. Do not mistake power for permission. Do not mistake slaughter for healing. Treat the dream as hospital and the hunt as surgery. Do not address the patrons unless the city's survival requires it. The devices were equally clear, lamps as anchors, marks as promises that a path home remained. Runes as durable agreement set inside the borders of skin. Workshop tools as scripture written in steel reminding hands that discipline is kinder than frenzy. The path from lamp to lamp, the soft ascent of stairs to the lawn, the steady presence at the counter. Each taught the same lesson in a different grammar. He sharpened, she stitched. They returned to districts with new steadiness. In Cathedral Ward, staircases held processions that looked almost like worship until one recognized fear in the downturned heads. In the woods near the old village, paths split and recombined like sentences translated too often. In factories that produced nothing but smoke, shadows lunged and retreated as if testing a hypothesis. Hunters did their work without spectacle. When pressed for speech, they explained their doctrine in simple lines and let those lines be enough. The dream's calm had a visible scar. The caretaker often stood at the gate and stared toward a gravestone that meant more to him than any other. There he allowed grief to exist in open air. The attendant did not join him. She guarded privacy as carefully as she guarded the messenger's crates. Once long ago there had been another hunter who walked with the caretaker at the seaside. Once long ago a bell rang in a tower that now stored regrets. In the dream, memory did not cut. It dulled like old steel and it weighed like stone. Not every visitor was cut from the same cloth. Some had been clerks or midwives who learned the weight of steel only when their streets filled with wrong shapes. Some had always touched violence and found in this labor the discipline that narrowed aim and hardened mercy into something useful. Some loved the city without asking it to love them back. Some loved the hunt itself and had to be corrected gently then firmly. The dream never lacked for arrivals. It learned to lack for speeches, work, rest, return, the lesson held. The fracture that would one day present itself openly was already there, thin as a hairline in glass. A sanctuary that sustains duty can also sustain denial. The dream allowed hunters to postpone a final accounting. It allowed the caretaker to postpone his own rest. It allowed the city to postpone changes it would have needed in daylight if nights like this were ever to end. So the dream did its job too well. Its success fed the pattern. It kept the engine running. It was a kindness with unintended consequences. The hedge nodded even as it hid the fact. In that long postponement, the moon over the garden shifted in character as the nights advanced. Sometimes it resembled ivory seen through gauze. Sometimes it resembled bone scraped clean by wind. Sometimes it hung low enough that the hedge threw a short shadow and the lamp seemed embarrassed to be needed. Hunters learned to calibrate themselves by that moon, as sailors once learned to read tide by the pull on a rope. When the moon reddened faintly, arrivals quickened. When it paled, the lawn grew quiet and the attendant's steps sounded louder on the boards. Names for certain presences were not often spoken aloud. One, Uden held inattention and blood together, a formless witness invoked in corners where voices like to echo. Another, later called the moon presence, held the moon as a sign rather than a planet. The dream belonged to the latter. The relationship was not symmetrical. The hunter asked for relief and received a grace carrying a cost beyond any ledger. The patron asked for the hunt to continue and received compliance from people who pretended the compliance was choice. The caretaker understood the asymmetry and kept his eyes on the work. Her patience did not thin. She was called a doll, and the word might have sounded dismissive to those who had never sought her help. In the dream, the word meant steadiness incarnate. She did not advise. She reminded. She did not command. She invited. She did not claim to heal minds. She created a room where minds could begin to heal themselves. When a hunter shook, she placed a ilam hand where calm could enter. When a hunter boasted, she tilted her head and waited until the words sounded foolish to the speaker. When a hunter fell silent, she waited with them until silence became strength. Beneath the city, the Thumerian labyrinth pressed upward in tombs and altars, reminding scholars that Yharnam stood on the patient rooms of a civilization that had already negotiated with great ones and kept the receipts in stone. At the far edge of dreaming, a child called Murgo slept without a cry, watched by something that behaved like a nurse in a storm. Elsewhere, architectures multiplied. A chapel learned to sing in registers designed for ears that did not resemble ours. A school built a ladder within thought and tried to climb into a ceiling that resisted tools. A village under watch put its faith in repeated phrases and neighborhood watchfulness. A manor housed a collection that should have remained in vaults, where the Canehurst name clung to old fabrics and colder ambitions. Each place generated its own echo in the dreams that lay nearby. The hunter's dream did not claim dominion. It claimed duty. It stayed useful by refusing to become doctrine in itself. Eventually, the veil thinned beyond the comfort of even the bold. A being that resembled an apology more than a statement could no longer keep the moon's appetite hidden. The city looked up. The sky looked back. Children cried in their sleep for reasons their parents could not soothe. Dogs barked at the same empty corner of the same alleys. Scholars' minds sparked like old wires. The dream responded by clarifying itself. Paths felt closer. The lamp's halo widened. The attendant's blessings grew quieter and more thorough. The workshop's tools looked newly sharpened even when no one touched the whetstone. He knew a meeting waited, as certain as the tide and as slow. It would not be a meeting of equals. It would be a confirmation of duty followed by release or replacement. It would happen under a moon that felt close enough to touch. It would happen with the attendant watching, her gaze on the horizon rather than on the blade. It would happen when a hunter who had carried too much finally stood still and listened for a voice that did not make sound. It would happen because cycles once wound demand closure. Not yet, the garden seemed to say when footsteps approached the stair. Not yet, when a whisper beyond the hedge made the night feel as thin as paper held to a candle. Not yet, when the caretaker paused, hand on the gate. Every postponement was a mercy. Every postponement tightened the thread that stretched across the city's night. The patron allowed postponements because hunters who rushed often failed, and failure wasted a resource it required. The dream knew this. It held steady. Bells rang in the city with tones that reminded listeners of water and of an older sea. Reports reached the dream of the school of Menses, whose leader Mikolash prayed to a deity that was also a thesis. Reports reached it of Yahargul, the unseen village, lifted into air by a will that did not need hands. Reports reached it of a cry from the cathedral's highest rooms that could not be forgotten or translated. The caretaker listened. He sharpened a blade that had already seen too much. He breathed the cool air of the lawn as if measuring it for the last time he might need to. He who once trained students to treat tools as scripture now taught the new ones to treat mercy as a sequence. Approach, assess, act, withdraw, rest, return. He who had walked streets beside a partner whose shadow still met his at the step now walked the lawn alone and saved his warmth for those who needed it. The dream made this possible. Without it, he would have broken and used his breaking as a story others would borrow to excuse their own. With it, he carried his breaking like a stone in a pocket, heavy and honest, and kept moving. She who had no past beyond the memory from which she had been shaped, possessed a future that would last beyond the next moon. She who did not sleep allowed others to borrow her stillness. She who did not tire allowed others to believe that their fatigue was a signal rather than a sentence. The dream gave her this purpose, and she returned it without accounting. The garden was her step. The workshop was her study. The lamp was her companion. The hunters were her reason to exist, and when one of them did not return, she wrote their absence in a ledger only she could read and closed the book gently. They who came and went began to tell one another that the dream was more than a place. It was a bond. It was a road that always led home so long as one remembered to carry the mark that declared one's right to walk it. It was proof that death was not a door but a tight corridor between rooms. It was an editor that trimmed fear into something usable. They brought back trophies less often. They brought back stories more often. The dream collected those stories the way a hospital collects thanks no plaque will ever list, and turned them into steadier hands. Now the hedge rustles more often. Now the moon lingers at the same angle regardless of the hour. Now the gravestone that holds the caretaker's attention receives more glances as he walks by. He knows the meeting is close. He does not dread it. He does not welcome it. He accepts that a cycle must close before any new arrangement can be proposed. He hopes that the hunter who stands before him will have brought enough understanding to finish neatly. He hopes the garden will be respected, that the attendant will be thanked, that the messengers will continue their small work undisturbed. Hope is allowed in the dream so long as it does not pretend to be certainty. The dream is an answer to a city's need and a question asked by a presence that watches tides without blinking. Its premise is cosmic and intimate. Its threat is corrosion and exhaustion. Its remedy is replenishment and restraint. It begins as refuge. It becomes ethic. It continues as tether. Soon the tether will be pulled taut. A name that is not often said will be present without being pronounced. The hunter will stand. The caretaker will speak. The garden will wait. The moon will attend. Threads of fate draw inward, precise and patient, inevitable. The garden waited while the city changed its sky. In the streets, a veil was lifted when a strange guardian fell, and the moon's color deepened until every stone seemed to hold a breath. Shapes that had lingered at the edges of thought became openly present, draped across cornices and bridges with patient hands that did not tire. The lamp in the dream brightened as if answering a call heard across water. The attendant spoke more softly. The caretaker paused more often at the threshold, as if measuring the distance between quiet grass and the noise of revelation. A nightmare is not a metaphor here. It is a place formed by a will, anchored by a ritual, shaped by guilt or desire or both. When the city crossed the line past which night no longer pretended to end, such places multiplied. The school of Mensis placed its ambition into an arrangement of stones and minds and called upward with words refined beyond human patience. The reply arrived as pressure rather than as speech. The unseen village grew visible only to those who could endure being seen from above. The sound of a child's distress rolled through corridors never built by human hands. Hunters returned to the dream holding more than wounds. They carried witnesses within their memory. The dream received these witnesses without surprise. It had always expected this season. The garden does not argue with the weather. The workshop does not refuse a tool because the street that dulled it lacked manners. The attendant measured the growing weight inside each visitor and placed strength where it would not inflame pride. Insight thickened the air like a spice that makes food compelling and dangerous. Hunters learned to hold their breath around the vessels that carried too much of it. They learned to step with the patience of old surgeons. They learned that mercy grows more exact as knowledge grows more terrible. In this world, relics do not announce themselves with trumpets. Remnants of birth and covenant are folded into jars and kept as if they were simply parts of a story no longer told in houses with shutters. Some remnants, once gathered, alter the terms of a meeting. The dream did not advertise this. It is not a house for dramatic speeches. And yet the truth remained. A hunter who had found and absorbed certain remnants carried a resistance that would only be tested once, and at a single threshold. Until then, the dream behaved as it always had. The lamp burned, the lawn shone, the caretaker's blade whispered against stone with the punctuality of a clock. The caretaker understood cycles better than anyone standing on soft ground. He knew that the dream's grace was not designed for permanence. It was designed for passage. Every passage must lead to a door that opens only one way. He had held that door for longer than most stories can retain without turning sentimental. He did not complain. He did not perform virtue. He held the door because a bargain had been made, and because without his hand on that wood the city would have broken earlier and noisier. He held it knowing that the one who would take his place had already entered the city and that the garden had already prepared the scene. She attended to those preparations in the way that someone tends fire with a kettle rather than with a poker. She increased or decreased what soothed. She added a blessing where habit would have placed a word. She walked the same path between counter and steps with a cadence that made hunters remember their pulse. She contained memory of countless partings and greeted each return as if it were the first. When the moon altered the color of her shadow on the board, she stood without remark. When messengers fetched a tool with almost playful urgency, she smiled with something that resembled pride, and did not call it that. Beyond the hedge, old rooms replayed older wrongs. Before Yharnam's modern nights, a coastal hamlet had been opened like a letter not meant for its reader. The body of a great one was taken from its proper silence, and a curse answered. That curse made its own neighborhood of thought and drew into it those who had done the deed or abetted it or inherited its duties without enough questions. The hunter's nightmare held its own chapel and its own scholars and its own shoreline, lapping at the same sea with new anger. It was not the dream. It touched the dream through those who carried both bargain and burden. In the nightmare, the first of the church's champions staggered under a glory that had turned to hunger. His name had once signified discipline and hope. Now his name was a warning spelled across the span of a blade that remembered liturgies and forgot restraint. A founder who had hurried beyond a teacher's caution burned in a beast's body that no sermon could excuse. A woman whose skill had once refined the art of the hunt stood watch above a clock's face, guarding a secret that had not grown lighter. She bore resemblance to the attendant of the dream and yet remained herself stern, unbending past tenderness. At the far edge, the curse took shape as grief rather than as rage, and the sea brought forth a child's howl that had no mouth and no comfort. Hunters who stepped into this nightmare learned the grammar of penance and found that every sentence ended at a shore. The dream observed and did not impose interpretation. It gave back breath and steadied grip. It reminded those who left that entering another's nightmare requires respect. It sent them with tools that had been designed for clarity rather than for spectacle. It received them again with hands that registered new scars and minds that carried quieter eyes. It noted that some returned with a new understanding of the caretaker's weight. It noted that some returned with the moral fatigue that follows seeing good intentions multiply harm. It neither excused nor condemned. It made the next necessary step possible. Doctrines in this realm do not demand congregations. They take form as oaths that leave trace within a body. One oath bound hunters to a discipline that preferred clean solutions to grand gestures. Another oath recalled an older knightly order sworn to punish what it called profanation. A zeal that sometimes drew blood in places where humility would have drawn a boundary instead. A third oath opened one to pale presences that teach about metamorphosis by making roots of stars and seeds of men. A fourth oath braided cooperation through radios of light and encouraged those who bore it to raise fallen companions quickly and without drama. These oaths did not erase personality. They edited it. The dream recognized them the way a hospital recognizes insignia on a coat and adjusts its expectations without needing to ask. Devices supported doctrines. Carol's runes, heard and recorded by a mind tuned to listen in the appropriate register, settled like constellations under the skin. Some increased poise, some refined breath, some deepen the well from which stamina is drawn without turning it into bravado. Lamps created a geography of return. Marks carried as sigils asserted one's right to step back into the garden when the mind shook or the lungs failed. Trick weapons retained their courtesy even when unfolded for work, letting a hunter choose range, tempo, and sentence structure in the middle of a paragraph written by teeth and fear. Attire stitched from memories as much as from cloth proved that lineage matters when one asks the night to answer kindly. Throughout the city's story braided with the dream in 3 strands. The first was the old academy whose headmaster counseled eyes open and conclusions delayed. He sat by water and taught that restraint is a form of courage that does not look impressive in paintings. The second was the church that took the blood and called it salvation, building stairs and choirs until its architecture resembled conviction, and its conviction resembled habit. The third was the independent workshop that held the line when theories cracked and that accepted that sometimes a knight requires a blade more than a book. The dream honored all 3 without adopting anyone as king. The fracture became open conflict only when a hunter, charged by circumstance and steadied by repetition, crossed the boundaries of nightmares as easily as one crosses a room. He struck down guardians that had once been scholars. He stepped through mirrors made of water and made of sleep. He answered a child's cry by silencing the hand that had turned that cry into a lantern. Each act simplified the sky. Each act brought the city closer to a single threshold. In the dream, the lamp glowed as if remembering a long-anticipated appointment. The caretaker felt the weight multiplied and then lightened. The attendant arranged supplies without looking hurried and stood by the gate for a longer moment than usual. The meeting would be simple in shape and complex in meaning. The caretaker would offer release, clean and final. The hunter would decide. Acceptance would cut the thread. The dream would fold. The city would wake into a morning that forgot the faces of those who had kept it alive. Refusal would force the next movement, a confrontation with the patron whose will had maintained the cycle. That being, the one who wore the moon as sign rather than as garment, would arrive the way gravity arrives, without footsteps. It would not speak with sounds. It would bind with presence, drape the hunter in an arrangement of obedience, and reset the dream with a new caretaker at its gate. There was a third possibility seated in the world's own strange biology. If the hunter had prepared by consuming certain remnants usually reserved for births, and for the contracts that accompany those births, the patron's binding would slip. What followed would not resemble victory in the human register. It would resemble a reclassification. A hunter would change category without changing heart. The dream would gain a new infant at the feet of the attendant, and she would cradle it with the same seriousness with which she had offered strength to grown hands. The garden would not fold. It would change key. These outcomes were not listed in any ledger kept on a desk. They lived in the texture of events and in the calm that the dream produced by its nature. The caretaker knew them and did not show his hand. He had made a bargain long ago at the urging of a friend who had believed that salvation could be manufactured if one only built the right devices and said the right prayers. He had accepted because he loved the city and feared failure more than he feared the consequences of undiscriminating providence. He had paid the price in years, and in rest he never took. He had trained students who had become masters and then warnings. He had watched a woman he admired disappear into a decision that left scars on a shore. He had remained. In the hunter's nightmare, echoes of his decision appeared as rooms in which time looped and voices repeated. The woman whose likeness inspired the attendant's face refused to let hunters pass until they carried enough memory of shame to face a village without committing its old crime again. The founder who had broken with restraint writhed and roared with a hunger that small prayers could not domesticate. A champion who had once been sung about now stood as a lesson in how faith can unmoor purpose when it ceases to listen. At the terminus, the sea returned what had been taken as a form of pain and demanded recognition without the soothing of explanation. The dream knew where its lanes ended. It did not lead hunters into the nightmare as a policy. It allowed those drawn to penance to find their path. It received them back and recorded their new steadiness in the way they held the hammer or the way they bowed. Small differences that matter in a school where death is frequent and maturity is the only decoration permitted. It watched as the city moved closer to that threshold where one presence yields to another and where choice collapses into consequence. It held breath without moving and waited. The city's minor stories braided into the dream with the intimacy of whispers. An old hunter in a tattered coat taught mercy to the merciless by ending their service when they transformed their creed into excuse. His visits to the garden were rare and quiet, marked by exchanges that required no words. A veteran who had turned his anger into guardianship stood on a tower and chose not to be excused by a ruined neighborhood, a lesson in how duty can become healing when it withdraws from pride. A pilgrim with a heavy wheel carried the memory of a zealous order into a finale that he misread as triumph, and the dream accepted his misunderstanding without rewarding it. A queen in a cold hall held a lineage that fed on blood with ritual rather than with hunger and waited in satin patience for a future that preferred reputations to reforms. The dream did not judge these threads loudly. It allowed each to inform the hunter's mind and then return to its task. When the moment arrived, it unfolded without spectacle. The garden's grass held dew that reflected a light no sun had provided. The lamp burned with steadiness that felt like a hand on a shoulder. The caretaker took his place beneath the tree where he liked to think. The attendant stood nearby, hands folded, eyes lowered the way one lowers them at the beginning of prayer. The hunter approached, slower now than on their first arrival, heavier with the weight of sights that cannot be forgotten, and lighter with the knowledge that purpose had not abandoned them. The offer was made. Acceptance or refusal would both end the cycle. Both required courage. Both were allowed by the bargain that had kept the dream running. If acceptance was chosen, the release was painless and exact. The garden faded as the city brightened. Morning entered houses with ordinary difficulties and familiar hopes. The dream's lawn remained in that part of memory where good rooms are kept. The caretaker closed his ledger. The attendant stood very still and did not cry. The messengers returned their tools to crates and waited without counting. If refusal was chosen and if no further preparation had been taken, the dream's patron gathered the hunter into a new obedience. The caretaker's weight left his shoulders and found theirs. The garden remained. The lamp continued. The attendant greeted. The city, whose nights continue regardless of the names on the gate, was served again. The mercy held, though its price had been transferred. The line continued. The thread remained taut. The cycle preserved itself the way tides preserve their schedule even when a lighthouse changes keepers. If refusal met preparation, the patron was forced to acknowledge a different order. The hunter stood, and where obedience would have been draped across them like a cloak, something infant and immense took its place. The dream did not resist. It absorbed the change and reconfigured it into a scene of gentleness. The attendant lifted what had been a hunter and would now be a seed of something that learns by listening. She rocked it not as a mother, but as a guardian who understands that power must be soothed at the beginning of its life. The garden did not fold. It reinterpreted itself. The lamp burned, now for a different thesis. The city slept as exhaustion's demand. The thread did not break. It altered its material. Afterward, the dream's outline remained in every version. Whether it folded, continued under a new keeper, or shifted to cradle a different future, the lawn's function remained as memory or as reality. Hunters passed, and new hunters would rise when streets again asked for steadiness. The workshop's principles endured because they were written in motion more than in ink. The attendant's patience endured because it was written in purpose. The caretaker's story ended or was transformed, but the lesson of his long service remained for those who wanted to understand why an old man would accept an impossible chore and not call himself a hero for doing it. Powers and limits, recorded silently through repetition, closed their ledger. The dream heals what stress has worn, not what betrayal has chosen. The dream clarifies resolve and skill, not the aim to which they are put. The dream refuels courage and empties vanity. The dream allows death to be an interval rather than an ending, so that duty can continue without becoming cruelty. The dream cannot remove guilt chosen with deliberation. The dream cannot excuse ambition that dresses itself in theology and calls it mercy. The dream cannot bribe the sky to become kinder. It can steady hands strong enough to build kinder days. The city's theology settled into its own clarity. The great ones answer to desire as much as to liturgy. Their responses are precise, patient, and indifferent to human reputations. Prayers arranged as experiments receive experimental answers. Theft dressed as research receives correction dressed as hauntings. Grief unanswered becomes storm and child. Oaths shape bodies, bodies shape oaths. Blood elevates and corrupts. Eyes teach and burn. Insistence makes a door. Restraint keeps a window open. In memory of seasons past, the dream kept a few objects exactly where they had always been. A chair held an imprint no cushion could forget. A set of tools lay in their drawer with the dignity of instruments that have done enough. A lantern's glass remained clean without being polished. The hedge kept its height. The gate kept its hinge. The path from lamp to steps wore slightly in the middle where countless feet had preferred to walk. The doll's footprints did not mark the boards because purpose does not leave scuffs. The messenger's small hands reached and folded and reached again, content without being simple. Old names persisted like stones visible in a shallow stream. Byrgenwerth with its doctrine of patience, the healing church with its ascents and descents. The choir with its interior cathedral tuned for the attention of stars. The school of Mensis with its long corridor of mirrors arranged in minds. The unseen village with its terrible honesty about who watched whom. Canehurst with its courtesies and its hungers. The Pythagorean labyrinth with its dead wards still lit by a will unfamiliar with quitting. Ueden, patient and formless, eloquent in blood. The moon presence, present without footsteps, direction without voice. Each name taught a lesson when spoken slowly. The hunter's path, whether ended or transformed, became an instruction for those who followed. He remembered that sleep can become duty when sleep opens into a garden where purpose does not exhaust the self. She remembered that gentleness does not oppose courage, but rather informs it. They remembered that tools carry ethics when shaped with memory. The city remembered nothing consciously. It continued as cities do with laundry and payments and births and the kinds of deaths no hymn anticipates. In the stories that linger, those who once walked to the dream by a single step in mind carried forward a habit of composure that made their neighbors' mornings easier. In the hunter's nightmare, the sea kept its sound. The curse did not evaporate after recognition. Penance seldom erases what causes it. It allows life to continue with fewer disguises. Ludwig's legend rested where it fell. Lawrence's fire cooled within its own ashes. Maria's stern kindness remained at her post, teaching without raising her voice that certain wrongs should not be repeated, even when the world calls for boldness and labels caution as fear. The orphan of Kos cried because grief requires sound. Hunters who listened carefully left the shore understanding more than they had intended to learn. Back in the dream, seasons pass without calendar. The moon sets the metronome. The lamp holds the key. The lawn keeps the room ready. The attendant waits, not with expectation, but with availability. The caretaker, if present, returns to his place and keeps the promise that began when a friend placed a hand on his shoulder and spoke of salvation in large rooms. If absent, his absence is honored without theater. The work continues. Hospitality remains the center. Sometimes the dream receives a hunter who feels very young even when age marks their face. The attendant greets them as if they were the first to climb these steps. She bestows strength in careful increments. She cautions without scolding. She gives them time to summarize their fear into statements that can be acted upon in alleys where clarity is a currency. The caretaker teaches them how to listen to a weapon as if it were a colleague. The messengers fetch, cheerful in a way that finds no opposite in the lexicon of nightmares. The lamp stays constant. The hedge nods only to the wind. Sometimes the dream is quiet for long stretches. In those intervals, the lawn seems wider. The moon looks farther away. The attendant stands by the flower bed and arranges what never wilts. She rests a hand on a gravestone whose words no longer matter and allows memory to breathe without performance. She turns and returns to the counter and arranges papers that do not need arranging. She looks toward the gate not because she hopes, but because readiness is her nature. If a cry ever carries across that hedge, she will be there to receive it. The dream's lesson for the city is unpretentious and severe. Mercy must be engineered as carefully as any instrument. Refuge must be tended with as much precision as any hunt. Strength flows best through humility. Insight requires shelter. Boldness without proportion becomes harm. Restraint without action becomes neglect. The right path runs between these stones and requires continual rehearsal, lamp to lamp, step to step, breath to breath. If one asks whether the dream is a kindness or a control, the answer is yes in a register that avoids quarrel. It is a kindness built by a control accepted for the sake of kindness, a paradox that held a city together long enough for some mornings to exist. It kept hands steady. It kept rage from calling itself law. It kept despair from dressing like wisdom. It kept a promise made by a man who understood debt and decided to place his back beneath it without seeking a monument in return. In certain tellings, the dream is gone. In these tellings, the garden exists only within those who once crossed its boards, a memory that descends whenever courage trembles and asks to be reminded how it stands. In other tellings, the dream persists under a different keeper, and the city continues to be served by the same ethics, patient and precise. In a third telling, the dream cradles something newly begun and spends its night singing a song without words that teaches power to be quiet before it speaks. All three speak to the same center. Duty continues. Gentleness holds the line. The moon attends. When hunters speak of the dream at the end of their service, they lower their voices as if stepping into a chapel. They speak not of victories, but of steadiness. They speak not of beasts, but of neighbors. They speak of a lawn that gave back something panic had taken. They thank a teacher whose name few remember. They thank a figure who resembled a woman who refused a shore. They thank a small population of messengers who managed weight and memory with a cheerfulness that made seriousness possible. They raise no banners. They resume ordinary attention. The dream remains the hinge of a world bent by revelation. It takes cosmic pressure and turns it into nightly courage. It takes intimate exhaustion and turns it into a patient return. It closes cycles with quiet hands. It opens futures with an infant's breath. It is a school disguised as a comfort, a hospital disguised as a home, a covenant disguised as a garden. In its presence, the city finds a tempo that permits love of place without illusion. In its absence, graduates carry the cadence forward because the lesson was written not on a board, but in the way their knees bend and their fingers rest. If the moon brightens again and the lamps feel wiser than they did, the path is known. The steps are familiar, the gate remembers its latch. The attendant will be present. The caretaker or his successor will hold his seat. The messengers will fetch what the hands require. The night will ask what it always asks. The dream will answer with the same steady voice. And when the meeting comes as cycles require, it will happen with the same composure, and the thread will tighten and the outcome will settle. And the story will place itself gently in the larger pattern where beginnings and endings share a border that feels like inevitability. The city learned to speak more quietly after the worst of the night had passed. It did not pretend to forget. It learned a grammar that allowed the past to be present without insisting upon itself. Windows reopened. Floors were swept in patterns older than any sermon. Laundry lines held threads that caught normal light instead of warning hues. In that daylight, the dream continued to exist as an arrangement in memory or as a lawn in truth, depending on how a particular story had ended. In every version, its lesson endured. Courage remained a sequence, not a shout. Beneath those ordinary mornings lay older corridors. The Pythagorean halls, hewn with patient hands and governed by agreements written before modern calendars, remained a geography of intent. Descending into them was less an expedition than a conversation with a civilization that had learned the shapes of reverence and risk by living with proximity to minds that do not sleep. Devices in those chambers behaved like sentences that still held meaning if one stepped softly enough to hear the verbs. Seals opened for those who brought the right combination of steadiness and humility. Guardians responded in kind. The deeper rooms reminded visitors that contracts outlast their signatories and that cities can sit on hospitals without recognizing the smell. Scholars who mapped those depths learned that these underrooms had taught the world above two critical lessons. First, that knowledge is safest when braided to restraint. Second, that containment requires a kind of love. The dream was not a copy of the labyrinth. It was a refinement, built for lives too brief to live with stone's patience and for hearts too warm to be comforted by iron alone. The messengers who scurried across the lawn carried in miniature the same ethic expressed by the lamp's steady glass and the hedge's consistent height, helpful service without pride. Those messengers were not an afterthought. They were inhabitants of the seam where waking and dreaming trade handshakes. They lived to carry, to present, to fetch, to hold. Their baths were markets without haggling, ledgers without debt, exchanges whose currency mixed gratitude and memory in proportions no accountant could balance. Hunters who learned to thank them did not waste thanks. In a world where grandeur and horror often travel within the same coat, the messenger's cheerfulness performed a clean surgery on despair. They kept the place human without becoming human themselves. Names attached to attire served as anchors for the hands that wore them. Cloth cut for churchmen held prayers even when the men had forgotten how to say them with kindness. Cloth cut for scholars held questions even when the scholars had switched to commands. Cloth cut for hunters held craft even when the streets tried to force haste. Some garments carried stains from older campaigns. Those stains did not frighten the dream. The attendant brushed them with care and let survivors decide whether to keep the marks as memorial or to trade them for lighter coats. She did not instruct. She tended. Her tending was instruction enough. Runes recorded by Carol remained the most intimate devices because they wrote themselves beneath the skin. To bear one was to accept a recalibration. Breath lengthened, attention clarified, balance improved. None of these changes announced themselves with banners. They manifested in the way a step landed, in the way a shoulder turned at exactly the right time, in the choice not to chase when the better answer was to wait. When more ambitious runes pressed close to root and bone, they did so only for those who had trained their minds to hold unusual shapes without breaking. The dream watched over these inscriptions the way a conservator watches over delicate paintings, aware of their beauty and of their potential to damage the unready. In the workshop, trick weapons preserved the city's tact. Each hinge and catch reflected a proposal about how to live among dangers without becoming one. The folded forms asked hunters to begin from caution. The unfolded forms asked them to reach only as far as thought could follow. Some blades stretched into poles that kept fear at the courtesy of distance. Some collapsed into compact tools capable of decisions so neat they hardly counted as violence. None rewarded frenzy. All rewarded patience, proportion, and fluency with the grammar of the streets. The caretaker had designed and refined these instruments with an ear tuned to restraint. The dream kept his sentences polished. Among the lives that braided with the dream and with one another, a few strands continue to instruct by their quietness. A hunter of hunters moved like dusk across rooftops and pews, ending service where service had transformed into its opposite. She brought to the dream a weariness that made conversation unnecessary. She received from it breath that made continuation possible. In her ledger, kindness appeared as refusal to let corruption rename itself as creed. Another watcher, fierce and stubborn atop a tower where the air remembered powder and heat, chose to be faithful to the living rather than to the thrill of ending. His posture taught a vocabulary of restraint to younger hands whose pride needed a different word for victory. Older orders haunted the city with their altars and ambitions. One drew a wheel from a theology that treated punishment as clarity and carried it through streets that had already paid. Another kept a throne polished and a ritual perfected, waiting for a season when crowns would be trusted again. Their representatives stepped into the dream as into a chapel that did not share their agenda. The attendant treated them evenly. The caretaker, if present, adjusted their tools and let outcomes teach. Some learned, some repeated old hours until repetition wore thin. The dream remained available without being persuaded. The choir maintained a room where sky could hear without being deafened. Their communion with a daughter of the cosmos created a line of attention that allowed certain prayers to travel, though the responses seldom matched the requests. When their members wandered into the dream, they did so with eyes full of star vocabulary and with hands that shook from contact. The dream calmed the hands and did nothing to dim the eyes. One does not ask a scholar to be less ambitious. One asks them to be more patient. The garden's lawn taught patience by being itself. In another corridor of thought, a master who preferred water to applause refused to abandon his sentence about eyes and restraint. He watched as students erected new grammars with pillars instead of clauses. He kept his chair and his posture. He let time do the instructing. When those loyal to his caution visited the dream, they carried manners that fit its rooms naturally. When those who had left his porch returned with proof they considered decisive, the dream offered them tea and let its calm reveal the stress lines in their reasoning without humiliation. Humility grown without humiliation endures. When nights extended past the city's ability to pretend, bells carried meanings beyond their official purpose. They joined and separated, they invited and refused. Behind their calls moved presences that treated distance as an idea rather than a measurement. Cooperation thrived under one tone. Solitude prevailed under another. The dream watched without policing. It made sure that those who desired to respond could do so with steadiness, and that those who needed to decline could do so without shame. In this garden, help was not a credit scored against the future. It was an exchange that simplified the present. Memory altars within the workshop arranged choices more than they granted power. A hunter approached them the way a writer approaches a desk and chose which convictions to place near the pulse for the next passage. The altars did not scold. They did not seduce. They provided the exact dignity good tools always provide. A sense that work matters and that one's hands are equal to it. Between visits to those tables, the lawn's dew wrote soft notes on boots. Small details saved lives as surely as blades did. As the city's worst storms passed, rumors gathered that the dream had folded. The rumors were sometimes true. A release granted without drama returned the hunters to morning shaped by small mercies and tolerable difficulties. The city forgot names and remembered only the steadiness that had kept its bricks from becoming rubble. In those tellings, the attendant became a memory of kindness that reappeared in other rooms when someone needed to gather courage quietly. The caretaker's chair remained empty in a way that made visitors straighten their backs out of respect. In other accounts, the dream persisted with a new keeper. The change was noticed only by those who looked at doors and could see weight and hinges. The lamp burned as before. The lawn held as before. The attendant greeted as before. Only the voice at the gate had changed, and its timbre carried the stoicism of someone who had already survived his own passage. The work continued. The city continued to need it. Seasons mattered only as rhythms, not as milestones. In still other accounts, a different infancy restated the city's future. The dream became lullaby and lesson. The attendant cradled a presence that did not know language yet understood rhythm. The garden adjusted to smaller footsteps and to metaphors that prefer seeds to swords. Hunters who visited this version of the dream learned to move as if shaping a future rather than as if ending a crisis. The work of the streets remained, yet it was accompanied by an awareness that beginnings have to be taught not to grow teeth too soon. The moon observed, interested, and impassive. All versions converged on the same ethic. The dream is intentional, it is negotiated, it exists to turn knowledge into care rather than into spectacle. It teaches that the human scale can be maintained within cosmic gravity if one builds rooms with the right proportions and keeps them clean. It insists that the end of a night is not the same as the forgetting of a night. It preserves skill without preserving trauma. It creates a place where those who serve can unlearn the lie that exhaustion is a proof of virtue. In a city where desperation often masqueraded as devotion, that insistence was radical. The last evenings in which the caretaker walked the lawn, he measured his steps as if stamping the path for those who would follow. He paused at the flower bed that never wilted. He stood by the gravestone whose words never changed. He checked the bench where new arrivals collected themselves before admitting fear. He sharpened tools left purposely dull by hands that mistrusted their own eagerness. He breathed. He allowed himself to be old. Then he stopped allowing it and stood as he had when instruction required him to look like a pillar even while feeling every tremor that passed through the building. He held his bargain with the grace of one who knows exactly why he made it and exactly what it cost. The attendant's last preparations for any ending looked like tidying. She aligned what most would not notice. She ensured that the messenger's crates contained what the next conversation would require. She placed strength where the next breath could find it. She looked at the lamp long enough to memorize the particular clarity of its glass. When it was time to stand by the gate, she did so with the serenity of someone who has accepted that good rooms are meant to be inherited as much as they are meant to be used. Hunters who returned after seasons of absence found the dream exactly as they had left it and entirely new. Such is the nature of rooms that serve purpose rather than fashion. The steps still creaked in the same place. The hedge still patterned the wind. The workshop still smelled of oil and clean timber. The difference sat within the hunter, whose stride carried less argument and more acceptance. They spoke less. They asked for less. They gave thanks without ceremony. They left with quieter minds and with hands that trusted themselves again. The dream's final gift to the city was not dramatic. It was a habit. It taught the inhabitants of Yharnam to value proportional action. It taught them to repair before replacing. It taught them to accept help without shame and to offer it without scorekeeping. It taught them to take sleep seriously and to treat waking as a responsibility, not as a claim. It taught them to see the moon as attendance rather than as omen. It taught them to read patience in the lines of a face and to grant patience to those whose lines revealed heavy stories. At twilight, if one stands on a certain step and listens without straining, one can hear the dream's cadence in the city's breath. Shops close with the rhythm of a blade returning to its folded form. Children are called inside with the kindness that characterizes well-timed words. A bell chimes without hurry. A dog settles near a door in a posture that understands duty and comfort at once. The sky changes color without trying to be noticed. The hedges beyond courtyards nod to winds that keep their promises. In such evenings, the dream feels less like a miracle and more like an achievement. A room built by need and maintained by love. If the moon ever draws close again in that particular way, if lamps find themselves bearing more meaning than flame, if messengers stir at thresholds and fetch tools with an energy that suggests gathering tides, the path is still there. It begins in willingness. It continues in practice. It ends in a meeting under branches where dew collects in beads that look like a script written for those who know how to read it. The presence that attends such meetings will not change its nature. The people who present themselves can change theirs. The dream will measure and accept. It will cradle and release. It will continue to translate cosmic pressure into human pace and will end its sentences with the same soft punctuation it has always preferred. Not yet, then now, then rest. The story of the hunter's dream belongs to a city that learned too late and then learned how to live with that lateness. It belongs to a craftsman who turned grief into service without letting it burn him hollow. It belongs to a figure whose likeness was borrowed to teach tenderness and who wore that assignment with dignity that made courage easier for those she touched. It belongs to the small hands that made logistics into almost play. It belongs to every hunter who returned limping, sat on the bench, breathed 3 times, rose and went back to streets that needed them. It belongs to mornings that felt ordinary and therefore holy. It belongs to the moon that watched without interfering more than that bargain allowed. In the end, whether remembered as a room in the mind or as a real lawn under a precise sky, the dream completed its purpose. It balanced intimacy with vastness. It translated grief into patience. It cleaned tools and straightened spines. It taught words to move aside when hands needed to work. It honored debts. It paid wages in breath and steadiness. It asked for nothing in return except truthfulness about limits and loyalty to neighbors. In a night that could have ruined a city, it crafted a tempo that made continuance possible, then handed that tempo to those who would need it next and closed its book gently. The moon remained. The hedge kept its line. The lamp's glass held its clarity. The gate's hinge remembered every turn. On certain evenings, when a step sounds like a familiar name and a breeze carries a trace of oil and clean wood, those who have never visited find themselves pausing at thresholds without knowing why. The body recalls what the mind never learned. The dream did not end so much as it became grammar. It is spoken whenever a hand steadies another hand, whenever a hunter returns a blade to its folded form instead of pressing forward for the sake of pride, whenever someone rebuilds a bench and sits on it and discovers that courage arrives on the 3rd breath. In that grammar, the city continues, measured and alert, threads of fate drawn quietly across its roofs, inevitability softened into serviceable days.